Jy luister na Isak Du Plessis op Nuuspod.
Good day and welcome to Nuuspod. In my virtual studio, I have today the chairman of ActionSA, Michael Beaumont. Now, ActionSA is not exactly a new kid on the block anymore. They have been coming for some time. They're going to take part in their first national election next year. There are people that have high hopes for the party. Sometimes hopes that I question a little bit, but I'm going to ask Michael about it, that he can tell me what's happening, where does it come from. And then there are a few other issues that I just want to talk to you about, Michael, that was part of the political terrain this past couple of months, which I think is important issues. But welcome to Nuuspod. It's the first time that we have an interview with you.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be in this discussion. I'm actually quite a big fan of the platform and enjoyed some of the other interviews. So, as I said to you earlier, I hope I can live up to the standard that you've set.
Thank you very much. My English is not as good as yours. I always say that I speak Free State English. Some way or the other, we're going to make each other understand what I want to say.
And I understand some Durban Afrikaans. So as I said, we can meet each other in the middle on this one, I'm sure.
Great. Michael, I must admit, the organizational work of ActionSA is quite impressive. It looks like you are deploying quite well across the country.
Yeah, Isaac, we made a decision to limit our contestation to only 6 out of 278 municipalities in 2021. It was a brave decision, but I think the right one ultimately, because we could have done what people had done before and contested everywhere and been a small party everywhere, but South Africa doesn't need another small party. It needs a real contender. And I think because of the results we were able to achieve, ActionSA is now placed with the established parties at the top of the list. And, now the expansion into 9 provinces has been the priority. It's a project that's gone very, very well. We've got very strong and capable leadership from people like Athol Trollip in the Eastern Cape and General Kwena Mangope in the Northwest and Zwakele Mwango in KZN, really excellent South Africans who, are leading our structures on the ground. And what we are finding is that the environment is ripe for a new organization to prevent an alternative to a failed political establishment. And I think our structures are growing very rapidly on a day-to-day basis, and it bears testament exactly to that point.
As you've said, you've got quite some names on your leadership tally. I mean, just to have Athol Trollip, he's a very impressive, strong politician. But it is also a fact that you lost some remarkable younger leaders. I'm thinking the likes of Bongani Baloyi that left you in the meantime. Is that a problem for the party?
Well, look, I mean, by the way, I'm not sure if you could add too many more names to the list, but off the top of my head, let's be clear, a political party doesn't want to be losing people. But certainly a political party is often framed by people coming and going. That is the nature of things. And a growing political party has more people coming than going. And I think that certainly remains the case, very much so for ActionSA. And I would be, being disingenuous if I didn't suggest a person like Bongani Baloyi wasn't a very credible and talented individual that we were sorry to see go. But at the end of the day, people must be aligned to what it is that we're trying to achieve in ActionSA. And I think one thing that you will find about our organization relative to others is we don't take 6 to 12 months to not make a decision. We tend to be quite decisive in the way in which we deal things, because the project before us and the mountain that has to be climbed is so significant that we can't afford to have distractions in anything that takes away from the core of our agenda to provide an alternative to the South African people.
Michael, the people that I have talked to before in regard of your party, I'm referring to, social conversations on social media, as well as formal interviews, all of them indicate that the party is expecting a figure of about 20, even 24% in some conversations in 2024. I'm a bit skeptic about it, in all honesty. Although I think the party is coming in strong, I've been dealing with politics long enough to think, I don't know if you would get more than 10%, which will still be very, very good in a first election.
Yeah, I suppose from their lips to God's ears, I suppose. But you know, I think this is where we must be very careful about social media. So certainly, I mean, 20% I think would be a little bit of an exaggeration. We must be clear, political parties that come in their first election, the best result in South African history was COPE with just over 7% in 2009. The EFF, I think, was in second in 2014 with about 6-point-something%. So, you know, you don't come in your first election and blow everyone away. That's wishful thinking. But certainly, I think we're going to better both of those results, and we see our potential between 10 and 15%. And what we are seeing is that when we are engaging South Africans on the ground, there's a high conversion rate. The real challenge for a new party is to become, you know, recognized and with your name and for voters to have an opinion of you, because this is a very big country. It's a very rural geography, and a lot of people are not accessing the information through interviews like this or on social media. It requires a face-to-face conversation on the ground on their doorstep to deal with the trust deficit that understandably exists in South African politics. And that takes time. It's the proverbial eating of the elephant. But certainly what we see is that we have the ability right now for a 10 to 15% result. We think we can be the largest party of a coalition with more than 20% in Gauteng, which I think is a very important point. But certainly, you know, that result continues to be something that we work towards on a daily basis to, you know, take our offer across the geography of this country.
That sounds a bit more realistic to me, I must admit.
Yeah,
Michael,
no, most definitely.
talking about your support and possible support, like you said, you don't want to be just another small party, but being able to do that, you need a significant part of your more rural. Ag, wat is kiesers in Engels nou alweer? Voters.
Voters.
And on the surface, it doesn't seem to me that ActionSA is getting that right now, or am I missing something?
I think you're definitely missing something, and I'd be happy to correct the understanding. You know, because so many people have always thought, with our origins being in places like Joburg, that this is going to be an urban party. But certainly what we are seeing is anything but that. So we have now started to demonstrate through contesting by-elections in places like rural KZN, where ActionSA's first by-election was a couple of months ago in Nongoma. And you don't get more rural than Nongoma, achieving 10.2% in our first outing. To put that in perspective, beating the ANC in 2 or 3 of the voting districts. And, you know, the EFF, after 10 years of existence, only managing 0.8%. In rural Limpopo and Seshego, the hometown of Julius Malema, an EFF ward on that occasion, ActionSA took 9.6%, both from the ANC and EFF. In KwaNobuhle in the Eastern Cape, I think it was 7.8%. And what we are seeing is, even in cases like that, where ActionSA was very new, having only been launched months before those by-elections, we're demonstrating that we can achieve 12% of the vote in those communities, taking support from the ANC and EFF. And Isaac, I think one of the things we need to be explicit about is South Africa also does not need another political party that rearranges the opposition marbles, so to speak. It needs a political party that wins votes from the ANC, because the only way the ANC is going to be removed from government is with the work of political parties in that regard. And I think ActionSA is demonstrating that we are achieving those kind of results at the expense of the ANC and EFF, and doing so outside of places like Gauteng as well.
That's an important point to make because even though it looks like the ANC is going to get some hard shots in the coming election, the fact still remains that a large part will still be there to reckon with. And that one party on its own is not going to make it. But we have a battle with coalition forming in South Africa since 2016. It's something that they just can't get right. Now, the DA says, let's do a moonshot back, which is hopeful to some, but others say, no, wait a little bit. The DA is too big for their shoes. They are arrogant, and we're not going to take part in that. What's ActionSA's stance on this?
Yeah, certainly. So there's no question. I mean, the DA are too big for their boots. And they made an announcement at an elective conference, which was very strange because party leaders were told to go and look at your email, wait for the email. Meanwhile, these other political parties had been at the table for a while asking the DA to come around. So in some ways, the DA was trying to appropriate something that hadn't started. But I think that's of secondary importance to the more important thing, and that is it's good that they're coming to the table. So, ActionSA welcomed that announcement. We are participating in those talks. The fourth meeting will, in fact, be taking place at 7 o'clock tonight. And progress is being made to what we regard to be an end state of great value. And that would basically look like leaders of various political parties that, in my opinion, could easily make up about 40% of the vote were an election held today, coming together and announcing that they will be working together, that they will have a non-aggression treaty throughout this campaign between them, that they will commit not to allow their votes to be used to put the ANC in government after the election. But I think more importantly, to actually even start to talk about some joint policy solutions around which we have agreement. Because these parties can agree on how we end load shedding. They can agree on how we tackle crime. They can agree on the broad strokes of economic reform. And I think we need to get past the idea of coalitions to keep the ANC and EFF out and talk about coalitions that actually have a coherent agenda that addresses the needs of South Africans. It is our opinion that if that can take place, that we can achieve a majority in 2024 by animating 24 million South Africans of voting age who did not vote in 2021. They see the ANC as vulnerable. They don't see anything on the other side of the equation that will give them confidence. And this is exactly what I think is going to be required to get them off the bench and into the game in what could be South Africa's change election. From our point of view, that's what we see is possible. And that's what we are buying into. We are cautiously optimistic at this point in time, optimistic because that is good for South Africa. And we want to align very strongly behind what we see as good for South Africa. But cautious in as much as we are nervous that the Democratic Alliance has demonstrated propensity to negotiate with the ANC. And the expression used is negotiating in the front and the back door. And there's a concern that this may be some kind of a pretense to justify their existing plans in that regard. But certainly we're going to watch it very, very carefully, and we will continue to engage in good faith and hope that they continue to do the same.
The EFF has been a bone of contention previously, especially between ActionSA and the DA in certain parts. Is that still an issue?
Well, I think let's be clear. ActionSA does not believe it is possible to work in a coalition with the EFF. We fundamentally agree on that perspective. Where we take a slightly different perspective from the DA, and I think most other parties in the coalition have cautioned the DA here, is that defining political parties as enemies is not the way we should be doing this, because what you do is you demonize their supporters. And this entire project needs to work on the basis of winning across support from political parties like the ANC and EFF so that we can achieve a majority. Even in terms of how it defines the ANC is very important that we don't define this thing as keeping parties out, but rather in terms of a positive vision about what we want to achieve in government for the South African people. Because again, if you define things about who you are against and not what you are in favor of, you are merely alienating people who are going to be required on the other end of the spectrum when you want to win the support from those parties. And we fundamentally believe that ActionSA is well placed to win votes from the EFF. And the EFF is busy renegotiating with the ANC. Their supporters do not like that. They left the ANC in 2013 for a reason. And I think a lot of that support can be vulnerable and won away from the EFF, which will become very important for the electoral project of this coalition. So ActionSA stands with other parties and saying to the DA, let's not define people as enemies. It's fine to say we can't work in coalition with those parties and that they're not part of the talks. But let's focus on defining ourselves in positive values and positive actions that we want to take.
There's a perception at the moment, and a perception that the DA themselves are feeding with not being straightforward about it, but that the DA would be willing to get into bed with the ANC. There's lots of criticism against the party about it. What's ActionSA stance on working with the ANC?
No, our stance is unequivocal in that regard. And it is that you cannot solve the problem in South Africa by partnering with the problem. And if you will allow me to get into that, because it's more than a jingle, the problem in South Africa is the ANC. And the manifestations of that problem have been very clear in terms of the failure of state institutions, cadre deployment, the slow growth of our economy, labor policies that slow our economic growth, load shedding, crime. You can point to any number of things that demonstrate that the problems in South Africa that need to be solved first require the removal of the ANC, because as long as the ANC is there, those problems will not be solved. And we have been unequivocal in this view because, the DA, as rumored and on many occasions, and prominent leaders have said that they would consider coalition with the ANC. And the truth is that you're not going to be able to fix the problems in South Africa if you're a smaller party in coalition with the ANC. Imagine, let's talk practically, Isaac, because government's not academic. It's a practical exercise. How do you fight corruption in the ANC? As you look around a cabinet table with people, many of whom ought to be in jail, not around a cabinet table. And how do you tackle the crime rate when, Becky Cele remains the person in charge of the police in this country? And how do you turn around the economy, even if you have the portfolio of trade and industry, but you have policies of the ANC that cripple the economy in other key portfolios? It's just not practical. South Africa needs change. This next election is a change referendum. And parties that want to align with the ANC are going to find themselves on the receiving end of a great deal of public anger, because market research is showing that 85% of South Africans want change. They don't believe the country isn't moving in the right direction. Now, anyone who aligns with the ANC is alienating that principle, and that's why we will align with political parties on a change agenda.
Just staying with the idea of a moonshot pact, I can see the advantage of something like this before an election, in that parties get the chance to get rid of the personal issues that have up to now been quite a heavy burden on the possibility of coalitions working. Is that an advantage according to your view of it?
It is an advantage, although I wouldn't say it's the primary advantage, because I think ultimately that does need to be resolved. It's not currently the focus of these talks. So we very much continue with the elephant in the room. We try and make progress in other regards. But what I see the real value to be is this. South African's legislative agenda is strange in as much as you get a very short time between an election and the constituting of a government. In fact, only 2 weeks. Around the world, in many places, you get months in order to negotiate coalitions. And the problem with that is that you then invariably have negotiations that are focused on who gets what. who gets this position, who gets that position. And you don't spend a lot of time aligning around what we are actually going to do in those positions. And for that reason, starting these talks now become very helpful so that we can actually create a very clear blueprint about what we want to do on the most pressing challenges facing South Africans, about their economy, about load shedding, about crime, about education, about their civil service, and to ensure we achieve alignment in that regard so that when we get to an election, we are clear on those things, and the 2-week window after an election can be used to focus on how we constitute government with an understanding that we've already agreed how we plan to govern.
I know that ActionSA doesn't like excluding other parties from coalition talks, but parties like the PA, Gaten McKenzie, and others have proven to not be very trustworthy with their loyalty.
Yeah, so it's a very complex question, and if you just indulge me for a moment.
Okay.
I think the first point is it would be obviously much more preferable if the swing votes and the kingmakers of some of these metros, by way of example, or in 2024, lay with political parties that were much more principled in their coalition decision-making and, stuck to those principles. And I'll give you an example. ActionSA's approach to coalitions is, even if we have issues with the DA, we're still going to remain in the coalition because we don't want to take out on the residents of a municipality what the political issues are between the two parties. Unfortunately, the PA, has adopted a view that when they get mistreated, they walk out of coalitions, and it's not desirable. But the reality that we have adopted is that you cannot afford for this project to become a country club of, like-minded, good old boys who are all think alike and act alike, because then you're not going to get a majority. And one of the first things that we did when we walked into this Moonshot Pact, which I must tell you is getting a new name, because everyone is scratching their heads on that one, to say, what is the objective here? Are we forming a group that's just going to be a tight-knit group, or are we trying to build a majority? And there was a consensus that this is about building a majority. And the minute you take that point of view, you need to align with a grouping of parties that you might not agree with everything about, but that ultimately will be necessary to achieve a majority. And in that moment, this thing became more about a broad church than it came about a tight-knit group in that way. But I think very importantly, Isaac, when it comes to parties like the PA, those parties' attitudes towards us are informed by how we treat them. And if you're going to make them an enemy, they will treat you like an enemy. And the PA is a very good example in this regard, because they have been at the negotiating table twice this year already, at the end of January and at the end of April, willing to return to our multi-party coalition in Johannesburg. And as you know, success begets success. That's how you bring them in nationally. That's how you bring them in other municipalities. And ultimately, the DA prefers for them to remain with the ANC. I suspect it has a lot to do with Western Cape politics, because it's much easier to decampaign the PA in the Western Cape when they can be accused of bringing the ANC in the back door, and the kind of Khafar campaign that the DA is notorious for. And it's very sad that that approach was taken, because the PA can be an ally or they can be an enemy. And all the parties in the coalition are saying, make them an ally, and the DA has made them an enemy. And it shows, if you want to talk about the risk in 2024 of that kind of thinking, look at what is happening in Johannesburg, where there's not a theoretical doomsday scenario of the ANC and EFF. There's an actual ANC and EFF government. Right now, the EFF holds the portfolio of public safety in Johannesburg, where, for example, they need to police private land rights and the occupation of illegal land. So it's quite important, and we bring this to this Moonshot Pact discussion, that we demonstrate that we are serious with our actions when we have the opportunity to do so. Because what has happened in Johannesburg is a case study of what we must avoid nationally in 2024.
I'm just worried about this specific smaller parties claiming positions, senior positions within a council, while you have other bigger parties that was preferred by the voters. there's some worrisome issue when a party seems to be going for the positions rather than the well-being of the citizens.
Look, absolutely. And you don't want to have parties that focus solely on the idea of position. But I also think, Isaac, we must be real about something, is that political parties can deliver change within a coalition by virtue of being in positions. So sometimes when a political party takes a viewpoint that we want to be in the portfolio of roads, they have a view that they can really drive a successful service delivery agenda through that portfolio. And let me tell you, there's no political party, including the DA, that doesn't negotiate very hard for those positions, because those positions essentially become the conduit through which you can demonstrate value within a coalition environment to the residents of that particular municipality. I guess the question really becomes whether parties are able to compromise in that environment, because it can't be, I want this or else there's nothing, because that's the kind of thing we need to guard against. Which certainly I think ActionSA has demonstrated on many occasions our willingness to compromise. We were willing to actually give up 2 of our own positions in Johannesburg for the PA to come in when it was clear that the DA wasn't willing to do so. And we did that for 2 reasons. I mean, on the broader and more altruistic sense, it's because what's the alternative? ANC and EFF government. How can ActionSA justify we wanted these positions and therefore if we don't get them, then the ANC and EFF will come back? Now, we can't justify that kind of thinking. But also at the same time, if you're going to have governments fall apart because you're unable to achieve a majority, then there's not going to be any positions. So if you're going to see it that way, it's much easier to understand that sacrifices are necessary to make coalitions work. And around the world, what you actually see are the bigger parties making those compromises, even disproportionately so to the smaller parties, because they understand that when you are mayors and when you're in charge, you stand the most to benefit if you are altruistic in the way you are generous towards your coalition partners, because people will see you as the responsible adult in the room who is doing what is necessary to make service delivery happen. And I think in some ways there needs to be a conversation about the responsibility of the anchor party, the bigger party in the coalition. Because what we often say to our DA colleagues is, you like to tell us that you are entitled to this because you're the biggest party. But as the saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. And there's a corresponding responsibility on you to be a responsible leader and to keep that majority together. They have to be the ones that keep people together and ensure that we don't lose those majorities.
I think we must organize that conversation between, with cake and and tea between Herman and Ellen, and televise it.
It sounds like great TV, doesn't
it? Then I will believe you.
Yes.
Michael, the ActionSA, another DA, or is there something that makes them different?
No, I think there's a massive difference between ActionSA and the DA, as well as other political parties. And while there's also overlaps, and we must also appreciate that. So I think the fact that some of our leaders, and I repeat, some of our leaders come from the DA, doesn't mean that we are aligned with the DA's way of thinking. We left the DA, as a matter of fact, because the DA did 180 on its values. And it was no longer the organization that we had joined way back when. So from that point of view, there's without a doubt differences in that regard. I think the DA adopts some positions as it relates to South Africa that we don't agree with. The DA wants to be colorblind in the way in which we deal with the issue of race and its continued legacy in South Africa. And certainly, while we all believe that is a necessary ideal that we must work towards, that we will not achieve a non-racial society unless we understand that the social injustice in our country and the economic injustice in our country arises from a racial legacy that requires very direct action. The kind of direct action that's not going to be achieved by pretending that you don't see color in that particular regard. And I also think it's quite clear that ActionSA is building a very diverse political party. I think the center of South African politics has been abandoned. I always say that the DA has moved to the right to out Freedom Front, the Freedom Front, and they've become the Freedom Front minus. and the ANC has moved to the left to out EFF the EFF. And here you have the center of South African politics, the place where the majority of good, law-abiding, freedom-loving South Africans reside, who are politically homeless. And that's why the work of ActionSA is succeeding, because we are building a diverse political party. I think, we are winning voting stations and districts in townships and suburbs, and we're winning them in informal settlements and CBDs. You could have a scenario in 2021 where ActionSA got 22% of the vote across the whole of Soweto and 21% in Sandton or Randburg. And that's the kind of genuine diversity that we are trying to build, a home for all South Africans, truly multiracial, and a place where South Africans see a little bit of themselves. And it's an ongoing project. But certainly, I think what many of us kind of remark upon in ActionSA is that it's not a project that has to be forced like it was in the DA. It's a genuine scenario that arises from having a multiracial support base. But our policy conference is going to be on the 12th to the 14th of September. We were a creature of local government, Isaac, and local government's not very ideological. Everyone agrees to the tenets of local government. But it is our national policy conference in September in many ways where I think we will create that clear, I don't say blue water, but green water between us and other political parties that will demonstrate how we are different in all of those important policy questions.
I would like to attend your conference.
In a heartbeat. I'll ensure that you are invited, because we do want it to be a interesting display to South Africans that demonstrates the diversity, it demonstrates the quality of discussion. And I mean, Isaac, just as a moment to engage on this important question, our policy conference is going to be unlike any other, because we are critical of politicians who've never educated a child writing a policy on education, who've never prosecuted a criminal writing a policy on criminal justice. And that is why our policy process is going to involve getting doctors and nurses and teachers and prosecutors and policemen and women around tables beforehand to say practically what must be done to fix these problems. Because a lot of people in this country know what has to be done to fix South Africa. They're just not in politics.
Talking about fixing stuff, I promise this is the last question, but I don't want to let this slip. The cholera issue.
Well, I mean, I think these things are hugely concerning, because what they arise from is a developing crisis of sanitation in South Africa. And I think in many ways, while we've been focusing on load shedding as a country and dealing with the kind of depths of load shedding, another form of crisis is arising in South Africa, and that's water and sanitation. In what we see in Tshwane is obviously hyper-localized, because Tshwane is affected very much by the issue of the Rooiwal wastewater treatment plant. Without any question, it is an issue that ActionSA has been driving for 2-3 years now. And I think very concerning to be involved in a coalition where, quite frankly, inadequate progress has been made in this regard. ActionSA has had to force forensic audits into the award of that tender to Edwin Sodi. The previous mayor in that coalition of ours had spent a lot of time denying any wrongdoing in that regard, despite the fact that the contractor had left the site, work had stopped, inadequate value for money had been achieved, and ultimately it had to be exposed. And that's lost time and lost progress towards resolving a 16-year human rights crisis that's going on in Hammanskraal every day. And it is an absolute tragedy. And it gets even worse when you now have, water tankers being delivered by, what's becoming organized crime, and people who really are milking the system. Hundreds of millions of rands are being spent on providing water tankers, and yet inadequate work is being done to fix the long-term requirement of tapped water that is clean and safe for people to drink. It's massively concerning.
Who's to blame for the Hammanskraal?
Well, I mean, it's a complex issue, and let me explain why, because it's not a cop-out. I mean, it's been going on 16 years. It began under the ANC's tenure in the mid-2000s. And if I'm very frank, it's continued under the failed leadership of people like Solly Msimanga and Randall Williams, whose failures in that regard are well documented, as a matter of fact. So without doubt, most of that took place in the tenure of ANC governments, and the ANC governments across our country have demonstrated a propensity to not understand that growing societies need growing infrastructure to deal with the demands. But I think what has been hugely disappointing is that coalitions in 2016 and in the first few years of the 2021 term have been inadequate at addressing this crisis with anywhere near the urgency of that they spoke about during their campaigns.
Michael Beaumont, Chairman of ActionSA, thank you very much for making time for us, and thank you for an enjoyable conversation. Hope to do so again soon.
I thoroughly enjoyed it in any time. Thank you, Isaac.
And please don't forget about me with that conference of yours.
I'll make sure there's a special seat in the front for you.
Thank you. Great.
Thank
Keep
you,
well,
Isaac.
Michael.
And you. Bye-bye.
Jy luister na Isak Du Plessis op Nuuspod.